Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those who are dialing in from the West Coast. Thanks so much for joining us today at the first workshop for CEBI's Next Generation Carbon-Free Energy Procurement Initiative, which we're going to call NextGen for short. By being here, you are what we call an activator, so we are very excited to have you in the room, and thank you so much for your time and attention today. As we explained over email and in the agenda, the first hour of the session is allocated to a level setting educational session. And so a lot of this, we'll explain a bit more, is to make sure everyone's on the same page about how clean energy procurement works today. We'll then spend the majority of the time, the remaining 2 hours, digging into a range of what we've identified as next generation customer objectives. The idea being that we want to give greater detail and depth to these different next-gen objectives so that over time, we can establish what solutions need to look like and what parts of the current system of clean energy markets have to evolve. And then we'll clarify how this feeds into future work. And I'll also just briefly introduce myself, Doug Miller, Deputy Director. I joined the CEBI and CEBI team just over 2 months ago, based in Washington, DC. And really, again, thank you so much for joining. This first part of the session is recorded for future reuse, and it's really just a time for you all to learn and make sure we're on the same page. And then the second 2 hours will be ones where we hope to have very active engagement from all of you all. So with that, let's go ahead and get started, Kyla, on the next slide. So just first to introduce CEBI for those who aren't familiar. CEBI is part of the family that CEBA is part of. So CEBI is a 501c3 nonprofit organization focused on providing research and education on the most challenging clean energy topics of our time. And we have 3 overall initiatives to support our mission at CEBI. And these are unlocking markets for clean energy customers, then catalyzing communities of customers to get involved in those markets, and over time to decarbonize the grid for all. And today we're talking about NextGen, which sits within this first pillar or first initiative. And so in short, what we want to do is to create new markets for next generation procurement by making new options available. And so essentially what the NextGen Initiative is all about is, if we know the way that clean energy markets work today, is essentially to push customers to procure wind and solar on an annual basis. We know that to achieve a fully decarbonized grid, we need more than wind and solar investments in certain locations. We need more wind and solar in more places. We need storage. We need other technology investments to help make sure that no matter when you flip on the switch, several years from now, it's powered with clean electricity. And so the components of the NextGen Initiative, which are shared here on the screen, all comprise the focus. So what we're doing today is crystallizing what are the objectives that those of you on the line at clean energy customers have for next generation procurement, so that we can figure out which and where to make changes among these 4 other components on the screen. So we hope to figure out what are the gaps and needs for around data, making more data available, for then what are new attributes we have to capture, and in the links between data and the attributes, and what are the changes required of registries. Then how do we provide greater recognition or incentive for customers to procure these new types of procurement options? And then what are the implications for greenhouse gas accounting? And so these are all the questions we're tackling, but recognizing that we could easily and quickly get lost in the weeds of all this, we're focused on let's define the customer objectives and figure out then the gaps and needs for these other components of the strategy. And so we're here at the very beginning of this journey today together. So again, I really welcome you all, and I'm so happy to have you in the room today to inform this conversation. Today and the upcoming workshop next month is defining what are next generation customer objectives so that we can build stories around these to define solution requirements, and then move toward these other deliverables and resources as we approach the second half of this year. And we think that this will help move the market, and I'm really excited to work on these with you. And I'll give the floor to my colleague, Kylie Ayuto, in a minute. But essentially what this first level setting educational session is about is we know that the current system of clean energy procurement is shaped by the data that are available, the attributes or recs that are available, accounting practices and leadership recognition programs. And so we are going to walk through what is procurement today, what's the role of the current system in shaping this type of procurement. Then we're going to pivot during the workshop into defining the customer objectives, again, so that we can then work toward the needs to evolve the system to support these new types of procurement so we can make more options available to you. And with that, I'll give Kyla the floor. And I'll just share that this part of the session will last about a half an hour. And then we will open up the floor for clarification questions before we then take a brief break before the workshop. But go ahead, Kyla.
Great, thanks, Doug. Hi, everybody. I'm Kyla Udoa. I serve as a senior associate on the market and policy innovation team at CEBI or CEBI, and I work on this NextGen Innovation Initiative. So let's start today by talking about the current state of voluntary procurement. So I just want to quickly preface that we know that for many of you on the line, this is not going to be new information, but essentially this is a basic overview for us to get really clear on the lay of the land of what's driving the market to behave the way it does today. And also to get those in our community that are in sort of adjacent roles like sustainability managers versus energy managers, really on the same page about the layers of information and standards that drive the current system before we talk about what's going to be needed to change it. So with that, let's start at the very highest level. So today, companies are aiming to achieve certain climate action goals or targets that enable them to make claims about their environmental impact, which at present really centers around an organization's need to manage its reputation and generally minimize environmental risk exposure, all of which, of course, can affect a company's bottom line. At the moment, all of this is being done voluntarily, with some guidelines and structure being provided by groups like WRI, GRI, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and a couple others. We may, as you know, see a lot of that change in the coming months with the SEC's proposed rule on climate-related disclosures, which would require large companies to begin disclosing their climate risks and greenhouse gas impacts in both periodic and registration reports. So that could have a significant impact on the market. But for now, companies are incentivized in the market to reduce their greenhouse gases by essentially participating in voluntary leadership recognition programs, and also by way of qualifying for ESG funds, but that piece of it we're not going to dive too deeply into today. So this conversation is going to discuss how companies are being incentivized to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions related to their purchased electricity, or Scope 2 emissions as defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which we'll get into later. If there's one thing that we want you to take away from today's conversation around the current market, it's that all of the major leadership recognition programs that currently exist are incentivizing companies to purchase clean electricity or lower their carbon emissions from purchased electricity by procuring renewable electricity to match their historical load on an annual basis. So I'll say that one more time: to procure renewable electricity to match their historical load on an annual basis. And that's it's had benefits, quite a lot of benefits, but it's also had some limitations, which we're going to discuss. But let's start by talking about how this actually works. So this probably looks familiar to many of you, but the most popular programs include the EPA's Green Power Partnership, the RE100, which of course is a leadership program formed in partnership with the Climate Group and CDP, and then the Science Based Targets Initiative. And so the ways that companies can receive public-facing recognition from each of these initiatives is sort of intertwined across the board. So in the EPA's Green Power Partnership, there's a few types of awards that they offer, but the bottom line is companies can be recognized for things like recognizing their behaviors or actions that accelerate the transition toward a clean energy future, following best practices and market principles, and then generally inspiring others to support green power. And then for RE100, in order for a company to be considered 100% renewable, it needs to either procure or self-produce 100% of its electricity throughout its entire operations from renewable sources. So they can do this by, as I said, either one, producing and using the renewable electricity from their own facilities, so meaning they consume the electricity they generate themselves, or they procure renewable electricity sourced from generators and suppliers in the market. And that can include a couple ways of procuring. So it's either direct purchases from specific generators, like power purchase agreements, which can be located either on-site or off-site, or it can include retail purchases from suppliers and utilities and retail products like green tariffs or green power pricing programs. And then also the procurement of standalone, what are called unbundled energy attribute certificates. And then the Science-Based Target Initiative applies to a company's entire greenhouse gas footprint, not just the emissions associated with its use of electricity. But in that, companies have to set targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions aligned with a 1.5 degrees Celsius atmospheric temperature increase. And it requires companies to do certain emissions reductions across its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And the target for scope 2 emissions, which, as I said before, are those that are related to a company's use of electricity, requires companies to actively procure at least 80% renewable electricity by 2025 and 100% by 2030. And that's actually largely aligned with the RE100 requirement. So I just want to note here that in both the RE100 and SBTI examples, targets can be achieved through matching a company's historical load to purchases of clean electricity, and it's not directly related to the actual carbon emissions associated with the load of the company. And we'll get into that mathematically a little bit later. But in general, at the bottom of the slide here, you can see the sort of full suite of electricity-related decarbonization options. In general, most companies will begin the journey with energy efficiency measures, but in order to actually get to zero, they have to procure renewables. And so on the next slide, we're going to talk about how they can actually prove or verify their purchases of renewables. Okay, so how do companies actually prove that they procured renewables? So energy attribute certificates, or EACs, are the verification instruments for companies wanting to claim the use of renewable electricity. And because the actual electrons on the power grid from different generation sources can't be tracked directly to an end consumer of electricity, unless, of course, on a sort of on-site non-grid connected example, the only way to actually track electrons coming from renewable generation sources is through a secondary market where these instruments are traded. So in other words, the purchase, ownership, and then retirement of an EAC is the only way to allow access to and be able to claim the use of renewable generation on a shared grid. And so different regions in the world have different terminologies for EACs. So in the US, we have RECs, or Renewable Energy Certificates, which are issued by registries. In the EU, they use Guarantees of Origin, or GOs, which are created by issuing bodies. And then in most other regions, there are IRECs, which cover about 50 countries, excluding North America and the EU. And so by definition, RECs, GOs, and IRECs are considered a contractual instrument with each certificate representing 1 megawatt hour of renewable generated electricity. And the REC generally includes data that you'll see here on the screen that's related to the type of the renewable resource and the location of that resource, the date stamp, or what's called the vintage of the generation, the emissions profile of that resource, which if it's a renewable resource, generally has a value of 0, and then a unique identification number. And then just as a little bit of historical context specific to the US, while RECs were originally developed as a mechanism for accounting and then verifying states' compliance with renewable portfolio standards, they were eventually adopted by the voluntary market over the past couple decades in an effort to essentially prevent double counting between compliance-related renewable energy generation and then that which was generated on behalf of an end consumer. And it should be noted that RPSs are a policy mechanism that only exists in the US, not in any other countries. So this sort of dual use of RECs on a compliance and voluntary market is unique to us. So how does this actually work in practice? On the right of the screen here is a diagram. Sorry, there was a fly in my face. So basically what happens, a renewable energy generator will generate a certain number of megawatt hours of electricity each month, and those renewable generated electrons will physically go into the power grid, where they'll then be dispersed to the hundreds of thousands or millions of end users of electricity on that grid. And then in this sort of secondary market, the generator is issued one REC for each megawatt hour of generation that's sold that month. And then it's able to sell the RECs that it's been issued to any end user who wants to claim, who wants to make a claim that they've been powered by renewable electricity, like, for example, any company that's trying to hit their net zero goal. Sorry, that's very distracting. And of course, being able to sell those RECs it creates an extra revenue stream for the generator. So that importantly allows them to increase their profitability from the project. So once it sells the REC, the generator is no longer allowed to use that specific REC for its own compliance purposes under any RPS in the US. Okay, and so then on the other side of the transaction, so when a company buys that REC from the generator, they then retire it, which means that they get to claim the renewable attribute of that electricity consumption. So if the company has set an RE100 target, as I pointed out on that last slide, that means that the company will probably aim to buy enough RECs each year to match its annual load, because doing so allows them to claim that they're 100% powered by renewable electricity. And so the last thing here on this slide is that right now RECs apply only to renewable generated electricity, which right now includes solar, wind, low impact small hydropower, biomass, biogas, and geothermal. But the definition of what actually counts as renewable can vary state by state. So it just depends on what the state or region's interpretation is. So for example, some states actually allow large scale hydropower, but other states don't. Some states don't allow biomass while others do. And then most importantly here, other types of carbon-free or complementary technologies like green hydrogen or energy storage, advanced nuclear, natural gas as CCS, other things like load shifting and demand response. None of those things at the moment don't qualify as under RECs. Okay, so once a company gets a hold of RECs, how does it actually use them to claim emissions reductions? So essentially, about 20 years ago, a multi-stakeholder partnership of NGOs and companies and governments and other experts developed the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to serve as an internationally accepted standard for global greenhouse gas accounting and reporting. And it remains managed today by WRI and WBCSD. It includes a broad array of applications, but the corporate standard and the sort of subsequent Scope 2 guidance, which was released in 2015, establishes the objectives for companies in reporting their Scope 2 emissions, which, as I mentioned before, by definition are the indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with the purchase of electricity, steam, heat, or cooling. And so the guidance asks companies to report their Scope 2 emissions in two ways, through the location-based and then the market-based methods. So the location-based method reflects the average emissions intensity of grids on which energy consumption occurs. So in other words, it captures the carbon intensity of the grids where the company's load is. And that method doesn't consider a company's electricity procurement decisions, although the ultimate sort of indication of the inventory number is going to be influenced by where the company decides to locate. And so location-based estimates rely on using average annual or monthly emissions factors from broad geographic, usually national regions, which are usually available from public entities. And that allows companies to use common inputs in their calculations. So in the US, companies will use the EPA's eGrid average annual emissions factors. And then importantly, a note on the location-based method, as I sort of said before, this method does not consider a company's specific procurement decisions. It essentially shows how greenhouse gas intensive a given grid remains. So in general, the portfolio of generation resources serving a grid won't necessarily change based on the individual action of a company. any shift of the carbon intensity is likely to be only the result of aggregated actions and sort of collective decision making of companies and suppliers and policymakers in that region. And then next, the market-based method. So this reflects the emissions from electricity that companies have purposefully chosen, or of course their lack of choice. So in contrast to that location-based method, the market-based method will account for a company's decision-making in procuring electricity and enables companies to essentially calculate a reduced scope 2 inventory by being able to secure contractual instruments that convey lower greenhouse gas emissions factors. And so, in using the market-based method, companies will demonstrate reductions in their scope 2 inventories after being able to execute a variety of transactions for clean energy. And that can include things like the purchase of energy attribute certificates, executing power purchase agreements, switching to electricity suppliers, or to their lower emission products and green tariffs. And so this method uses emissions factors from contractual instruments, which includes any type of contract between two parties for the sale and purchase of energy, either bundled with attributes about the energy generation or for unbundled claims. And then to actually calculate the market-based inventory, the scope 2 guidance, it actually prescribes a hierarchy for applying emissions factors of those contractual instruments against consumption. And it also gives like a sort of set of quality criteria to ensure that the instruments meet certain standards. And so it states at first that companies need to apply the energy attribute certificates and recognizes those as the contractual instrument with the highest level of precision in making claims. And then in the absence of certificates, a company would then next use the contractual emission data option in the hierarchy, starting with contracts for power, as you can see number 2 here, like PPAs, followed by supplier-specific emission rates, and then residual mixes. And then finally, in the total absence of any contractual instruments, a company would apply that location-based grid average emission factor. And so one important note here, which I'll further explain using some math very shortly, is that the market-based method, it does not limit the extent to which companies can rely on unbundled energy attribute certificates to reduce their reported market-based scope 2 inventory. And so what that means is that they can basically buy as many RECs as they like, or really as many RECs as what would match their annual load, and it can apply those across grid subnational regions, so long as they're within the same national market boundary. And again, in just a second, I'll show you what that looks like. So how does that actually work in practice? This is going to be just a quick example of the location-based method, and then I'll show 2 examples of the market-based method. So here, as you can see, a company would first find its activity data or annual consumption data through its utility. Doug, can you see my cursor on the screen? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Cool. Thanks. So it would find its annual consumption data through its utility and then multiply that annual consumption data in each subregion by the grid average emission factor in that region. So in this example, the EPA's e-grid emissions factors are being used. And so that gives you, over here, you would sum up all of for each subregion, and that will give you the total scope 2 emissions. So in this example, you can see that the company has one on-site leased solar facility generating 500 megawatt hours of electricity, for which it retains its own RECs. And so because it retains its RECs and it's an on-site source, the company doesn't use any electricity from the grid. Therefore, they don't have to use that grid average emissions factor in that instance. Okay, so the 2 quick examples of the market-based method. So the first example is going to be using mixed contractual information. So as I said, since scope 2 takes into account a company's decision to procure renewables, they use the contractual information where it's available. So in this example, same example as before, we have that same 1,000 megawatt hours of electricity in California. This time, though, it's covered by green tariffs for 100% of its consumption, and therefore has 0 emissions related to the load. As compared to, of course, the location-based in this column here. It's got the same 500 megawatt hours of on-site leased solar, that stays the same. Then you can see in New York that 250 RECs were purchased to cancel out half the load in that region. And then lastly, in Florida, there were no additional REC purchases that were made, so they needed to use the next tier on the emissions factor hierarchy, which was the utilities provided emission factor. And in this example, you can actually see that the utility specific emission factor was higher than the grid average. And so that resulted in a larger market-based value than the location-based value. But so as you can see in this example, while the emissions related to the actual load of the company in the regions it operates was about 836,000 pounds of CO2e, the market-based method allowed them to claim only 192,000 pounds. And then the last quick example is the purchase of 1,500 RECs and being able to apply those where they like. So what they did here is they started out, they bought 1,500 RECs and they started out by applying them to the location where their load had the greatest carbon intensity. So they started in California, they applied 1,000 RECs there, and they canceled out their load in that region. Then they, after that, they went to the next highest region, which was, looks like it was Florida. They used 100 RECs there to cancel out their load in that region before then going to New York and using the last 400 RECs to cancel out their load, remaining with 14,000 pounds of CO2e in that region. And so as you might have inferred from this example, what that means is that a company can procure all of its RECs, for example, in a region, let's say from a project in New York, where the emissions from the grid are actually already low to begin with. And then it can apply those RECs to their load in other states where the company operates that might have higher grid carbon intensities. Okay, so what is the current system then of data, attribute instruments, greenhouse gas accounting standards, and leadership recognition programs really incentivize? And I said this at the beginning, it incentivizes and allows companies to procure renewable electricity to match historical load on an annual basis. And I want to just say that this has actually had enormous success and has accomplished what it intended to when it was developed a couple decades ago, which is to deploy more renewables on the grid. And I just want to give a couple statistics to back that up. So energy customers have already contracted for more than 47 gigawatts of renewable energy since 2008. And that's about 20% of all wind and solar capacity in the US. That's huge. And what that's done is really drive down air pollution, but also it's lowered energy costs for American businesses and families, and that's hugely important. And last year, in 2021, voluntary energy customers contracted for over 11 gigawatts of clean energy, which was the equivalent of 40% of all new carbon-free capacity installed last year. And this sort of rapid deployment of renewables has also had some other really notable benefits. For example, it's made renewables more profitable by adding that second revenue stream, RECs, which has also improved the bankability of projects. It's helped support the repowering and maintenance of existing facilities. And then lastly, it's helped sort of build political clout for companies to really be able to move the market for clean energy. But of course, while all those systems and standards developed over the last 25 years have resulted in significant deployment, they also now face challenges to being able to fully decarbonize the US grid. And so sort of in summary here, these current strategies are one, based on historical consumption rather than forecasted load. And that matters because material decarbonization of a grid requires looking at potential carbon that will be emitted by the generation mix used to power any given grid in the future, and not necessarily the carbon that was emitted into the atmosphere by the generation that occurred yesterday or last year. And two just important terms that I want to quickly reference here that are being used to describe these differences are the terms attributional and consequential emissions or accounting. And so attributional accounting is the measurement of the historical emissions sort of inventory. So basically any sort of standard greenhouse gas inventory that a company will calculate is considered an attributional through an attributional framework. And then consequential emissions or accounting is being used to define the measurement of future reductions of emissions based on a decision to consume or source electricity differently. So Other terms that you might be hearing that are commonly being used here are avoided emissions, marginal emissions reductions, and then emissionality. And I'll just point out that the methodology by which one can do consequential accounting is still being discussed, but stay tuned. CEBI is going to be putting out a primer in the next couple months that will provide an overview of the sort of application of the consequential emissions framework. And then secondly, current procurement is being done on an annual basis rather than during the time that the load occurs. And that matters because the carbon intensity of the grid in which a company operates can fluctuate significantly depending on either the time of the day, for example, like during peak load when all the coal and natural gas powered generation is fired up, or it can vary by season, just generally when the sun shines less or wind is not blowing. And so when you average the emissions over the course of the year and apply a single emissions factor to the load of a company, it really doesn't paint a clear picture of the actual carbon intensity of a company's load. And also it doesn't allow the company to be able to sort of make and get credit for potentially very impactful decisions like load shifting or demand response during a time where the grid is particularly carbon intensive. Thirdly, current strategies allow companies to procure renewables or buy RECs in any region of the US or stated international market boundary, regardless of where their load actually occurs. And that matters because, as you saw in that last calculation example, the carbon intensity of any kind of grid in one state or region can vary significantly than the grid where a company's load actually occurs. And yet RECs, which have a unit of a megawatt hour and not carbon, can be applied across those regions regardless. And then I'll just say quickly on the flip side, when talking about international market boundaries, there are some regions that just generally do not have market access at all where a company might have load. So companies are wholly unable to decarbonize their load in those regions. And then lastly, current options only allow companies to procure and get RECs for qualified renewable energy products, regardless of the decarbonization potential of other carbon-free or complementary technologies. And so ultimately, all of those limitations have resulted in things like uneven wind and solar deployment, which has caused market saturation and curtailment in some regions, the limited growth of these sort of critical complementary zero carbon technologies that we're actually hearing many customers want, and then just generally missed opportunities for customers to be able to accelerate systemic decarbonization of the grid. Okay, and so in closing, and before we head over to the workshop portion of today, so what are companies trying to do now to be able to create more decarbonization impact with their clean energy procurement choices? So through an energy customer questionnaire that we provided to CEBA members earlier this year, we were able to identify these 8 what we're calling next generation procurement objectives. So we're hearing that customers want to be able to match their load with clean electricity on a 24/7 basis, or they want to be able to get credit for buying clean electricity at the most carbon intensive times of day or locations. They want to be able to apply over procurement of clean electricity from certain regions to places where they may not have procurement options, like in that example in international markets where they just don't have the ability to move the market at all. They want to be able to get credit for buying clean electricity to cover the electricity use of their supply chains. And then they want to be able to buy and get credit for any carbon-free energy resource, as I mentioned, like energy storage, as one example. And then lastly here, they want to be able to include and get credit for systemic grid decarbonization when they're measuring their climate impact. So whether that's influencing state governments, directly influencing with utilities, or from a regulatory perspective. And then just one sort of non-carbon impact I wanted to make a note of is that we're hearing frequently from energy customers that they really want to be able to make and get credit for making social and community impacts with their clean energy procurement. And so in today's workshop, we're going to really dive into these 8 NextGen objectives. But with that, I'm going to just pass back to Doug, and we'll transition into some Q&A about this. But back over to you, Doug.
Great. Well, thanks again, Kyla, for that great walkthrough of how clean energy procurement happens today and the system around it. And just for those, I know some folks had trouble dialing in just a recap of what we've covered so far in this level setting exercise was, how does procurement work today? What's the system around it? And then we'll soon dive into what the future of clean energy procurement looks like. But before doing that, we just wanted to set aside roughly about 10 or 15 minutes right now to ask clarifying questions about anything that Kyla walked through. This is not the workshop session that's coming. So just looking for any clarification questions that folks may have. And what I suggest is either people put their questions in the chat box or ideally raise their hand. So I'll stop there. All right, I see one from Parkeet.
Hi, Doug and Kyla. My name is Parikit Sinha. I'm a First Solar. We are a RE100 signatory and are looking to, for different options to get to 100% renewable electricity. In the list of, in the previous slide where you had the list of different things that buyers want, there's one topic that I wanted to suggest that is missing, which is the supply chain of purchased electricity. So this is talking about the upstream emissions that happens from buying electricity in terms of extracting raw materials and transmission distribution before you get to the generator. And is there any in the workshop, or is there any time to talk about additional ideas that that could be helpful in scope 2 accounting? Right now, this topic that I just mentioned is part of scope 3 accounting. Mm-hmm. So you can measure your upstream emissions from purchased electricity there. But if it were in scope 2, it would be a lot more powerful in influencing the decisions of buyers.
Yeah, well, it's a great question and an important one. Of course, even what you're alluding to too is points the importance of energy efficiency because of the environmental impacts of any clean energy investment to the physical components. So what I suggest is we will put this on what we call a bike rack for the workshop session. We have allocated assuming we have time, roughly 15 or so minutes at the end of the workshop for new ideas like this. So we will do that. And if it's all right, I'll move to the next question, but we will put that on our bike rack.
I'll just super quickly say, though, that I think we could group that in with the getting credit for buying clean electricity up and down your supply chain, because as you pointed out, this is all scope 3. So the solution is, how do you get to apply clean energy procurement to scope 3?
Yep. So that's a good point, Bryn. So park it with that. Then perhaps when we have that, we'll have roughly 10 or 12 minutes for that topic. We can include some points there. So next, let's go to, I think the second hand I saw was Maham.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the very insightful presentation. I just had a quick clarifying question. So in this slide where the different types of mechanisms of procuring renewable energy was discussed, there was a PPA, PPA procurement was discussed, and it was for on-site generation as well, and for off-site renewable energy projects. So just wanted to understand what the difference between direct and a physical PPA in an off-site project versus an on-site would be.
So the question is, what's the difference between? Can you say that one more time?
So there is direct physical PPA listed on-site renewable energy projects as well, and then there is an off-site renewable energy project direct physical PPA listed too.
Yeah, I mean, the main difference there is making use of the power purchase agreement format, but for investing in renewables that are physically on the property you own versus supporting investments in the wider grid.
Oh, okay, so it's something that's in the grid but is not on the property, or something that's
physically on your rooftop.
Oh, okay, so if something's on the property, a utility will have to be involved to have a direct connect, or just trying to understand the difference.
I may call on one of my PPA experts if she's on the line. Misty, are you there?
I am, and I'm, do me a favor and sort of state that again, because I'm here sort of making sure that I answer this in the right way. Can you just state your question again?
Sure. So like, I know on-site projects include like rooftop solar or like on-site solar panels and all of that, but there's a direct physical PPA listed as an on-site renewable project as well. So just wanted to understand the difference between that and an off-site renewable energy project. Is the difference only the fact that you have a utility or like some third entity involved in that on-site renewable asset versus like a rooftop solar or like something else that you might have on site versus like an offsite renewable energy PPA?
Excellent question. And actually, this is a really important part to level set for a second as we go in, and not the definitions, but let me start here. You have your sort of typical what I'm gonna call on-site generation. So either PV on the roof or on land that you own. Generally a direct physical PPA. Most of the time we're talking about those as off-site, but how they operate in sort of accounting frameworks will be slightly different. So you have to sort of think about what we're talking about in terms of like, where is this thing physically located, and then how might you account for it? So let's just be clear. So a direct or physically directed or retail, we call them all kinds of different things. In general, those are utility scale, away from your own land, but then they are physically sleeved or otherwise controlled to your end use at your facility. But how that generally works, for example, those physically directed or retail PPAs, they have to be matched. They can be they have to be sort of matched to the load of the facility. So and so generally they are filled in with brown power in hours where that asset is not producing. You might even have a power marketer that's helping with that, or a retail service provider that's also helping sort of sleeve that offsite physical PPA. Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely clarifies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Misty. I think the next hand I saw was Avi, then Bruce, we can go to you next.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks for the great presentation. A couple of kind of hybrid comments clarifying questions. One is, there was a distinction made earlier between attributional and consequential. I guess my observation is that I think I hear pretty different definitions for what those things mean, and particularly what attributional means. And I think it might be something worth actually maybe a little follow-up on, or a little conversation about what we think those terms mean, and whether there's a clear distinction between that and consequential, and if so, what that distinction is. And then the second point is on the list of kind of limitations of existing approaches. I just would observe that it seemed like those were mainly focused on limitations to matching, and there's a kind of the alternative framework that was got at in terms of the topics we'll be discussing more in the workshop, in terms of more focused on a lack of incentives for maximizing decarbonization impact, which is kind of a different thing from megawatt hour matching. So just want to make sure that that is kind of on the radar for a kind of in my view, a pretty critical limitation of the current system.
So just to clarify, that your first question was about the role of the consequential emissions accounting?
The first was about the definition of attributional versus consequential accounting.
Yeah, so for one, for folks' knowledge, there is a paper that we will be releasing in the forthcoming months that goes into, it's essentially a primer on what is consequential accounting. So that's something that is coming, that will just explain how it works and how companies are looking at using it. Where essentially what it's all about is looking at this idea of an avoided emission from an action, and there's more details about how it works, but that's something that's forthcoming. And your point about attributional accounting, that's essentially capturing attributes like like a REC that gives you a property right over the green electrons that are in the grid. But I think to your second points, Avi, those are some of the things we hope that we'll have some discussion about during the workshop. I'm not sure if that helps answer your.
Yeah, happy to discuss more on the second point. On the first point, I still think there's probably some clarification to be had, and I think the primer is less focused on accounting than on forward-going analysis. But again, maybe something we can follow up on later in the workshop.
Yeah, I think just to add, I think there is a lack of consensus, it seems, at the moment around the definitions around these things. So I would definitely welcome another conversation, Avi, to get your thoughts on the definitions of these two things. And then secondly, around your point around the limitations and getting them clear to not just be about matching, but also making decarbonization impact. I think perhaps in the workshop portion, let's dig into that a little bit more, because I'd love to hear how you might want to characterize these things.
The great questions. And this also is kind of pushing us toward the second session already. But so Bruce, before your question, if you still have it, because I see your hand went down, I just want to remind folks that in a minute or two, we'll give people five or 10 minutes. If you need to grab a coffee or water, take a minute, and we will start the workshop session in about 10 minutes. But Bruce, do you still have a question?
No, I put it in the chat. I was just making an observation that all on-site installations aren't procured and aren't capital spend. You can have an on-site installation that's a PPA form. So to the earlier question from the participant, just want you seemed to me like that there was, the way it was stated, that wasn't brought up, and I just wanted to bring it up.
Bruce,
Thank you. Thank you.
Important, and I think one of the, we can sort of talk about later whether the framework is sort of, I think we were getting at, and why I wanted to answer that precisely is whether you're sort of behind the meter or in front of the meter. You can have on-site installations that you buy or have PPAs, and that's usually set by sort of state law or otherwise. But that's why I wanted to make sure the question. But I think sometimes when we're talking about these frameworks, we're really talking about, is it a behind the meter generating asset or sort of front of the meter? So we can talk more about that in the breakout groups. But thank you, Bruce, for jumping in on that.
Is there maybe another question or two before any folks may step away from their computer for a minute before we kick off the workshop component?
Doug, it sounded like somebody, it wasn't, it shows up as me, but it wasn't me. How a company is accounting for baseline utility decarbonization efforts.
So I'll start on this one, and if others from the team want to jump in, I think one way to think about this is looking at location versus market-based carbon accounting. So if you're looking at location-based accounting for greenhouse gas emissions, that's looking at essentially, to make it very simple, multiplying your megawatt hours of consumption times the carbon intensity of the grid. So of course, if your utility makes improvements over time to reduce the carbon intensity of your grid, your location-based emissions will go down. And then of course, to the one other point Avi made around attributional markets, if you procure RECs, that's then a way to reduce your market-based emissions down towards zero, because for each megawatt hour you link to a REC, renewable energy certificate, or another certificate purchased in other countries, the emissions factor you can use is zero for that. And of course, this is as the current system. I know some folks on the line may have opinions about how or where that maybe that could be modified, but in terms of how the market works today, that's this general setup. Great. Well, seeing no additional questions for this right this second, I suggest folks take about 5 minutes and come back. We'll be on the line if people want to ask questions, but then at the top of the half hour, we will kick off the workshop session. So, and with this too, we will stop the recording, because when we kick off the workshop, it will not be recorded, and we have a set of ground rules for that session that we'll introduce in a few minutes.